Welcome to Best of Birth Bozeman. My interview today is with Jazmin Hieronymous of Frigg Birth.
Yeah.
Jazmin, could you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Jazmin Hieronymous. Let's see, what do? Well, in my personal life, I have 8 kids, and I'm one for husband and 2 for dogs that are like the loves of my life. And then professionally, I'm a midwife, and I provide out-of-hospital care to families. So that looks like prenatal care, labor and birth, postpartum care. I provide free lactation services for the entire family. We do well woman care, preconception care, STI testing, you name it, we probably provide it, or we know we're to send our families together. Yeah.
Fantastic. On your website,
Yeah.
you say you have the goal of providing family-centered care to low-risk families looking for holistic, evidence-based care.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about that and why that matters to you and for our community.
Yeah, that's a mouthful. But what it really means is my goal is to provide comprehensive care that touches a family, not just on the pregnancy or whatever that woman has going on, but really takes into the context of that woman, whatever's going on, top to bottom. So she's not just a uterus coming into my office, she's a full human. I try to provide care to the full human, but not just her, because she's only usually a piece to her puzzle. And we provide care also to her family. Sometimes that extends to her extended family, to her partner. We provide those services, or really become a hub for finding services. And really, in Frigg, we work really hard to be evidence-based. So that means we're all the time reading studies, looking at the new information that's coming out. And since I'm the boss, I can make changes very, very quickly that matches the newest evidence, the newest research that's coming out. I always tell people that at Frigg, we meet community standards of care. What that means is we meet what our hospital-based providers are doing. All my families have access to everything that's offered up at the hospital. We really pride ourselves in doing that in true informed consent way. So my families are never surprised when they come to my office of, an intervention or an option that's being offered. They would have been given a heads up so they can do research and make sure that all their questions are answered, that they've been given all the options, and we've talked about the pros and cons of those options. And then we take those options that are routinely offered and we tailor them to what that family really truly needs. Sometimes they need just that, sometimes they need more than that, and sometimes they need less than that. And I really trust my families that they're invested way more in their outcomes for themselves and their baby than I can ever be. And I'm super invested in their outcomes, but I trust them to make really great decisions for themselves and their families. And I think that's what that means, is that everything's tailored to them. I always say I'm like the GPS of their adventure. I'll tell them when I think it's a really great path or when we need to detour, but they're driving the bus most of the time.
Just as an aside, I love what you said about your ability to implement the newest evidence on things, whereas I think it's important for people watching to know that often it takes the medical system decades to implement the newest evidence-based care, because we get so entrenched in this is the way it's always done.
Yeah, and sometimes it's also the bureaucracy that those providers are facing. I have to say, I've said this a lot, I think my hospital-based providers kind of get slammed a lot for things that it's not in their hands. Right? I think everyone who picked obstetrics as their field of choice does it because it's a passion. It's a really, really hard job. It's very stressful at times, and I think sometimes the hospital community gets slammed for things that they can't control. They can't control how fast they can make changes. They have so many more hands in their pot telling them what they have to do, how they have to do it. It really, a lot of times the providers are kind of super limited. And I just have the privilege of being private practice and being the boss. And that is the privilege that I have, and they don't have that privilege.
Right. Makes sense. What sparked your passion for midwifery care?
So that's a tough question in that I really wish my answer was different. I worked with an amazing midwife who was my best friend, and she had like the ultimate, like my perfect answer. Ever since she was a little girl, she wanted to be a midwife and loved babies and bellies, and it was just, she knew. And that's not how I started. When I was a young adult, really, I wanted to be an author and write books, and I wanted to be a mom. And that was it. Not that that was it, but that was like my goal. I wanted a big family. I wanted a chaotic family. I wanted dogs, and I just wanted to have babies and write books and read books. And then that's not what really happened. So I had an experience with my third pregnancy. My first two pregnancies, easy births. I birthed really, really well. My second birth, I actually was able to be delivered by a community midwife in the hospital. And she really put the bug in my ear. She's like, you realize you do this really well. Have you ever thought about out of hospital? And I was like, I don't even know what that is. What does that mean? And she basically said, well, you can stay in your own bed and eat your own food. And I was like, sold, right? And so with my third pregnancy, we had moved back to my ex-husband's home state. And I was like, let's do this out of hospital. And I was really very, very naive about it. I didn't understand the culture of that state in the midwifery community. I didn't understand the aggression towards midwives from the hospital-based providers. And so I picked a midwife, and unfortunately at 11 weeks, I had a late first-term miscarriage. And because of the culture of the state, the midwife was really afraid to send me into the hospital. It was in that state, it was a Class C misdemeanor for every time you practiced midwifery without a license, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that's like every prenatal you do, everything you do, right? And so I was basically bleeding out at my home, and I started to go into shock, and my midwife gave me some pretty erroneous and negligent information. I almost died at home. By the time I got to the hospital, I was in really bad condition, and it's really when my eyes were opened. The ER doc was pretty cruel, and when I asked for like pain meds and just some help, I was basically told that he was going to give me the natural birth that I was after, and I was denied care and left to just bleed out on the table, literally bleeding everywhere at the table. And this is probably where my empathy and my compassion and my love for OBs that really do love them comes in, because the only person that was really kind to me was the OB who walked in. He had an hour drive in. He was pretty rural state, and he looked at me and he said, I'm really sorry. I'm going to take care of you. We're going to take care of you. And he did. And I woke up the next day and was like, that is not what I expected to happen. And how could both of these worlds do such a terrible job at taking care of me? And it took me about a year and a half to kind of work through that experience. And I just woke up one day and I was like, well, I would say if they can do it so badly, I bet I can do it better. And I had one of two influential people in my life besides my parents were the GP and an anesthesiologist in my life. And so I've never had angst against the medical community. And I was just like, I bet I can find a middle ground. I bet I can find a way to provide compassionate, holistic care that's going to really provide great care. But then also, when we need to make a change and we need higher intervention, I bet I can do that too. And so I just started my journey. That was 2008, and I kind of was pretty tenacious. It was a hard state to get to become a midwife in. I was the first ever fully apprenticed midwife in that state to become a midwife. I worked with 6 different hospitals, varying on the spectrum of aggression towards midwives, and I made some major headway. I had doctors who before I left, who started to kind of trust me in hospitals, who weren't quite so leery of what we did as a midwife. But it wasn't the beautiful story. This is what I always wanted to do. It was really like, I almost died because a midwife gave me really bad advice. And then I was left basically dying in the ER for punitive reasons. And no human should have to endure that ever. And I wanted that to be different.
Absolutely. And we don't need to dive into the topic, but what's happening now in states across the country with abortion care being taken away, and that same circumstance happening to women all over this country, that must really hit home for you.
It does. I think regardless of the political climate, that kind of care is deficient regardless. And there needs to be their changes need to be made. And it starts with comprehensive holistic care. It starts with being able to go to your trusted provider and be able to access the care. It starts with untying providers' hands. It starts with a continuity of care from start to finish. So there's a lot of work that needs to be made, and it needs to be made on a human level.
Absolutely. What do you think is the biggest challenge facing families in Bozeman and our surrounding area when it comes to getting safe, high-quality care in pregnancy and postpartum?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge I see is kind of the challenge that we experience on so many different levels in this valley, and that is an economic challenge. You know, I provide really amazing care, I think, but it's not cheap, right? I'm just being really honest, it's not cheap. Compared to like a hospital birth, it is. But the problem is that insurance oftentimes doesn't cover it really well. For me to become in-network, there's a trade-off to be an in-network provider. I have to take a pay cut. That means I have to increase my volume so I can make it in the valley, and I'm not willing to do that. And so I think it's mostly economic. You know, people are struggling to pay their mortgages and buy food, right? And it's this weird economy that really I think is problematic and really a huge stumbling block. I see so many people in my office who really want midwifery care and they can't afford it. And that breaks my heart.
We have a huge divide, I think, in our
100%.
city between the ultra wealthy
And the people who
middle class, lower
run
class.
the city.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. And it's totally prohibitive to midwifery care. I mean, you know, as a provider, I can only do so much, right? I also live in the valley. I also have a mortgage, and you know, if I want to stay low volume, I have to keep my prices where they're at, right? I don't want to go high volume, and I have to reduce care, and that's what I'm willing to do.
Right. And do you see that as being an issue for OBs as well, who are kind of forced into a high volume?
100%. 100%. I talk to a lot of people. This is again where they get kind of slammed, right? Because they see so many people, and it's, you know, 2-hour wait to get in for a 5-minute visit. And the truth of the matter is, when you're having to play the insurance game, let alone play the Medicaid game, midwives were just approved for Medicaid payment. The problem with that is a Medicaid reimbursement from start to finish, prenatal, postpartum, newborn care is $1,800 for me.
For a 9 to 10 month gestation
Yes.
pregnancy, $1,800.
Yes.
That's it.
Yes. And so when you look at an OB, right, when you bill out for like a $200 visit, but you're only getting $50, well, you're kind of deficient on a business side of things, $150. So then you have to see 4 patients to make up what maybe you should be getting for 1 patient. And so it's not necessarily the OB's fault, it's the insurance game fault. It's that, you know, some insurance companies negotiate better, so they pay less. And it's crazy. It's a numbers game. And yeah, money and insurance is a huge problem.
I fully agree. Here in Bozeman, our local hospital has about a 25 to 30% C-section rate, depending on who you ask, which is higher than the WHO recommends.
Yeah.
In your opinion, how does this make midwifery care important, despite the belief of many that hospitals are the safe choice for labor and delivery?
Yeah, I think both worlds are safe choices for the right families, right? I only deal in low risk. That's why my C-section rate is so low, right? So I'm not seeing people with high risk conditions, but it may be safer for them to have a C-section than a vaginal birth or a child labor or whatever. So I think because I have the time to take with my families, you know, my visits are at least an hour long. We do a ton of care with them. Because I have that ability, my families are so much more prepared for whatever's coming down the line that they deal with it really well. We can manage it when it's small, right? I'm able to catch big things really small because I have the time to look and the time to take care of it. So I think midwives, regardless of outcomes as far as like numbers, right? Regardless of that, I have the time to give that family, and I have the time to kind of assess things a little bit deeper, a little bit sooner, because I don't have to wait until it's big. Right? In fact, I don't want to wait till it's big. And so I think just in that sense alone, when I find things that are big, even if it does result in a C-section, it's less traumatic because I found it, and I found it small, and if we can find it small, we have options. And we have time to at least have a conversation so my families are prepared what's coming down the line. I'm there with them 100% of the time, even if we transfer to the hospital, so they have that continuity of care. Even though if we transfer in, I'm not their provider, but I'm their familiar face. I'm the person who's invested 9 months into building this relationship with them. They know that Jazmin is there just for them, right? I'm not there for any other reason. And I'm going to be there until they're done with my care. And so I think that's why we're so important, is the time that we have to invest in them, that we are able to take that time and build those relationships. And like I said, regardless of what the birth looks like, reduce trauma. That should be every provider's goal, really, right? I don't look at C-section versus vaginal birth. I look at how can I reduce trauma, because this event, whatever it looks like, is going to change this family forever. And I take that so seriously. Like, I watch the words they say, I, really evaluate the interventions I'm offering, making sure that what I'm offering and what I'm saying is really appropriate for that family, because I have their trust, and that's a huge deal. And I can either do really beautiful things with that, or I can cause some harm. And I always want to do beautiful things and reduce trauma for my families. And I think that's what's beautiful about midwives. It's what we do.
That is so special, and makes midwifery sound like a little bit of a unicorn.
That's fair. That's fair.
But can you tell us a little bit more about what makes your care and frigg birth and everything so special?
Yeah, I don't. So when I'm asked that, I don't like to do a compare and contrast with anyone else. I think every provider in this valley does this really, really well. And I extend that to my midwife colleagues. I worked in an area in a state where I was the only midwife for a 4-hour radius. I worked the top and the bottom of the state. People didn't have options. And so when I moved here, I was so excited that there were other midwives, and everyone brings their own spin and has their own personalities. And I think that's amazing. And I told one midwife, a friend of mine, and she kind of got a little offended until I explained myself. I don't view any midwife in this valley, other practice, as competition, right? And she was kind of like, whoa, what are you saying? And I was like, what I'm saying is I am the best at what I do, and you are the best at what you do. And I 100% believe that, right? And another midwife, the best at what she does. So I think that's really, really beautiful. So what frigg does, what is our spin then, right? Because we're not everyone's cup of coffee. Our spin is that we simply look at care. I'm simply looking at someone's care and establishing a really beautiful care relationship with them. Like, if you were to come into my office, you would notice maybe that there's not many personal identifiers in the office. And that's simply because I want my space to be neutral. Mm-hmm. And other midwives need differently. That's totally fine, right? I do you. But in my space, I want it to be neutral. And that's because I have had this career of being able to work with just a beautiful spectrum of humans. And I don't ever want someone to walk into my space and feel like, oh, do I fit? Is it going to be okay? Can I? Right? And so Jazmin's space and my staff, we're just neutral. So that means you won't see our political opinions, you won't see our religious opinions, you won't see anything like that. I'll tell really funny stories from my family because it's hilarious, right? 8 kids and dogs and a husband. Funny, and that humanizes me, but it also humanizes parenting and toddlers and all that. But they will never hear like where I go to church, if I go to church. They won't hear who I vote for. None of that's in the office. And because of that, I've had this really beautiful ability to just work with so many different people. The first birth I ever attended was in Alabama, and it was for a Black Muslim family. And then the second birth was for an Indian Hindi family. And then I was the Mennonite midwife over there, and I did ultra liberal births over there too, right? And here, same thing. I worked with families who live on the res. I worked with Mennonite families, LDS families, liberal families, all different kinds of families. And I think the reason I can do that is because we're just neutral. We're just here to provide really beautiful care to you. And whatever identifiers you walk in with, it's totally fine. They're your identifiers, and when you're in my space, this is your space, and you get to fill it with whatever you have. And the only rule we have is just no hate. And I've not encountered anyone who can't follow that rule, but it's really beautiful. One time I had a super liberal family walk in and they were leaving and they passed my Mennonite family and I just sat and was like, that's cool. That's cool. I'm so privileged that I get to do that. So that's one thing that Frigg does that's really, I think, special and unique. We don't lead with any personal identifiers. The other thing is we are super focused on safety. So I'm a midwife who's not pushing anyone's safety boundaries. My agenda is not out of hospital birth, which is weird for an out of hospital birth midwife to say, right? This is what I do, but it's not my agenda. My agenda is a safe birth and a non-traumatic birth. And I tell people we can have a beautiful birth regardless of the venue. We can provide really great care, that comprehensive holistic care, regardless of where we have a baby. But my agenda is not home. My agenda is safe and keeping people empowered.
Yes. Yes. I think people who've been following me for a long time know my birth stories are both in hospital in California. One, I showed up at the hospital pushing, had a baby. Like almost zero intervention. It was fabulous. Second baby was an unplanned cesarean. Not what I wanted, but definitely something that I chose. Because my provider gave me the space to like understand what was happening. And know my options. And I was like, okay, this is the birth this baby needs. Both beautiful, empowered births. And a provider who really supported my desires, but also gave me the facts. Like, this is what's going on. This is what I recommend. It's up to you.
What a beautiful provider. I tell people a lot, I do now. My last baby, my 8th baby, was born 2.5 years ago. I had before her, I'd had a home birth a year before with one of my kids and had Irish twins. But I was older with the last two, and I had some things going on. And I had a really amazing provider. I'll never forget him. And I was struggling with this decision on where I was going to birth this baby, not because my midwife brain didn't know where, but because I felt this amazing pressure to do what the community, my community, expected me to do, which was to have my baby out of the hospital. And I remember talking to a few people in the birth world, and I was really kind of slammed for considering a birth for deaconess. And I'll never forget the words my provider said to me. And he said, "Don't you deserve the options that you would give your families? Don't you deserve that care?" And man, that hit home, right? Like, yeah, I do. And I had my last baby at the deaconess by choice. And it was beautiful. And it was empowered, and it was informed, and it was where she needed to be born. And because of that provider, I was able to kind of like slough off some of the pressure and just focus on what this baby and what my body needed. And that's what I tell people. We follow the body of the baby and where they need to be born. And that's what we do.
That's awesome. You have over 18 years.
I'm in my 18th year,
of experience, which is amazing. What is the biggest shift you've seen in the birth world throughout your career and here locally in Bozeman?
So that's a weird question, only because the state I started in was so anti-midwife and aggressive. And when I started, access to like online education for midwives wasn't super common. It was just kind of like the opening up of like the internet, right? This is old stuff, right? I think I might have still had dial-up at the time. And so access was really hard. Our education process, or our process to get from, not credentialed to nationally credentialed, was there, but in its infancy still, even though it's from like the 80s and the 90s. We were still sussing out a lot. And so what I've seen now, like overall in the midwifery world, is this beautiful streamlining of the process, right? We can always work on access to education. We can always work on economic access to pay for the education, but the process has been really drastically streamlined. So if someone wanted to be a midwife, you could go and like Google it, do the Googles, and then you got, and then it's like, that makes sense. Okay, there's steps, I get it. Whereas I think when I started, it was really like the steps were there, but maybe those little steps in between steps, like how do you get the training? I don't really know. That's all been filled in for us. And that's really, really beautiful. But then also the comparison is when I moved here 10 years ago, I went from a state really kind of I was not integrated at all. I was the only above board midwife in the state, to walking into a state where I'm fully integrated. I carry a state license. I walk into the hospital and I have an amazing relationship with my OB colleagues up there. And they're like, "Oh, hey, Jazmin." And I'm my first year here, I was like, is this, hi? Do I have to hide? I'm the midwife, right? And they, the same provider who was my provider, who was the first OB I ever encountered, Sam Saletti, and he was just like, Jazmin, we're so happy to have you. And I remember, like, it was my first transfer in, and I was like, huh? Oh, okay. And so that, on a personal level, was really very, very different. But I think the fact that we are nationally streamlining things, that more and more states are getting on board, that midwives fill the gap. We've done really well in comprehensively midwifery care is really amazing and can do things, especially in very rural states. We really do fill in the gaps. So that's really amazing. In the Valley, I just see us becoming more and more integrated, forming better collaborative relationships with the providers, not just at the hospital, but in the Valley, right? I feel like my referral list just keeps expanding with different people, different providers. And I think going from not having any of that and having to really hunt for things and coming here, that's just beautiful. And to see it just keep growing and becoming more and more positive, I think that's really beautiful.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting to note that like the credentialing and licensing for midwives is still different, like state to state to state to state across the country. And so where you came from, it was harder. Montana, maybe a little bit easier. Some states require that you're a certified professional midwife to deliver out of the hospital. Some states require that you're a certified nurse midwife to deliver in hospital or out. And it's just different everywhere you go. So do you have any advice for families who are looking for a midwife when they're like looking at credentials and like what to look for?
Yeah, it's really confusing. And I think that's where the whole field has kind of made it muddy as far as what we are. And so the first thing I would do is I would start with understanding what are credentials, right? And so that's exhaustive, and confusing as it is. And then focusing on your state requirements, like what does your state specifically require for a midwife? Some states offer licensure, some don't, and then looking at what are the requirements. And then I always recommend when you've figured out the credentials, figured out what the state licensing is, do the midwives in the state carry licenses? In Montana, yes. In other states, no. Like Mississippi, no, they're autonomous. Figure that part out. And then I highly recommend meeting with as many midwives as you possibly can, right? I've had people come in my office and I'm their first interview and they're like, I'd like to hire you. And I'm like, no. And they're like, what? I'm like, no. I want you to go meet all the midwives. Let me write them all down for you. Because when you pick someone, I want you to be like, yes, right? Yes, that's my person. Once again, I'm not everyone's cup of coffee. That's totally fine. I'm old enough to realize that's okay. But I want them to find their perfect cup of coffee, right? And so I usually send them out and be like, go meet bunches of midwives. And the other recommendation I have is ask the hard questions.
What would the hard question be? What comes to mind for you?
Yeah, hard question would be, what is your agenda with birth, right? You want to know what is that midwife thinking at the end? What's her end goal, right? That's important. You want to know that end goal matches your end goal, right? You want to ask, has she ever lost a mom or a baby? That's a hard question. It's a hard question to answer, but you want to ask. I've always said, if there's a question that I've asked that I'm afraid to answer, I need to be done. I'm as transparent, as direct as I can possibly be. And that's just the way Jazmin is, like it or love it. But I think families deserve that. Families deserve transparency. Families deserve to know. And families get to make decisions. So ask the hard questions. Have you seen any of these emergencies? What are the most common emergencies we might encounter? Do you know the risk or the rates of those emergencies? Are there any emergencies that aren't actually better handled in hospital? Mm-hmm. How do you handle those? Ask the questions. Mm-hmm. If it's burning in your brain, sometimes people are like, oh, I don't know if I should ask that. And I'm like, absolutely. If that's what you're saying, absolutely you should ask that. Absolutely. There's no stupid question. There's no too hard question. And if there is, that might not be your provider.
Right. What springs to mind for me in relation to that is the United States has the highest maternal mortality rate of all industrialized nations, with 98.4% of birthing people delivering in hospital. Yeah. It's like that doesn't seem to line up. Why? But also, especially now, it seems there's a big push that's very like anti-science, don't trust the system. And yet medical care is necessary and life-saving
Yeah.
when you need it. I had a cesarean I didn't want.
Mhm.
I recognize that that was the birth my baby needed on that day. And I'm
Yes.
so grateful that that was something I could access. So can you speak to this kind of conflict and like
Yeah.
confusion?
It's hard, isn't it? And it's hard for me as a provider to navigate that. I can't imagine how hard it would be for, a family who's tiptoeing into this world and not understand, right? I think both worlds do families a disservice when we're not giving them all the true answers, right? So true answers, for example, would be a lot of times families want to know, well, can I go past 40 weeks? Can I go past 42 weeks? The true answer is not, well, your risk of fetal demise doubles. It is a true answer in one way, right? It's a little fear mongering. The true answer is, let me tell you the numbers. And then let me break down the numbers and how that means for you, right? And then you get to make that decision when you see the numbers. I like raw numbers as opposed to percentages, because percentages, we all know stats can be tweaked, right? And I really trust my families, right? And so I want to give them the real answers. This is your real rate of cord collapse and out of hospital birth. This is the real rate. And this is, if this happens at a hospital, this is the real rate of not a great outcome, right? So I think we have to be honest. We can paint a beautiful picture of home birth, and I think home birth is beautiful, but once again, not the die-hard home birther, right? And so I tell my families that. I am not the die-hard home birther. If you are the family who's like, I'm home birthing, no matter what, let me find you the midwife that will do that for you, but it's not Jazmin, right? You have to hear my informed consent. I have to be able to give you the informed consent, and that's the numbers. I'm also not a sugarcoater, and I believe that should be across the board. Let's not sugarcoat things. Let's trust the families to make the good decisions, the right decision for them. But let's give them the information. Let's not sugarcoat it and paint the beautiful picture. Let's be honest. And I think that's where we have to start in both worlds, is being really honest. And I think it starts with trusting the families. I talked to a provider one time, and we were having a little disagreement about something that needed to happen. And the provider said, I understand what you're saying, Jazmin. I just don't trust that they understand. And as a provider, I understand that. How do I know that that family knows what they knows? I have to trust. I have to trust that when I give them the information, once again, I trust that they're invested in those outcomes way more than I could ever be invested, and I'm super invested. And if I trust that, and I trust them to make good decisions, if I give them not the right answers, but the real information, I trust them.
Two things come to mind. One, earlier you're speaking about competition, and I think like every family, every person is going to find the care provider that is right for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that plays into there isn't competition, because if the person is right for you as a provider and you are right for them, it'll work.
Yeah.
And if not, they're going to find the other person who is right for them.
Yeah.
And then also speaking about not wanting to sugarcoat things, how do you do that while also not sort of instilling maybe a little bit of anxiety or fear, and knowing how the feedback loop of labor works and how it's so important to really trust the process and not feel afraid and not feel stressed out for labor to work really well? How do you balance that?
That's hard, right? It's definitely a hard balance. So first and foremost, my families, once they've been in my care for a while, they know I'm really direct. I'm also pretty compassionate and pretty soft. That's what a lot of people in the community who don't know me on that level don't get to see, is that Jazmin is not just aggressive and confident and, whatever. But I'm really soft, and I have the ability to do that. So like at 36 weeks, I always have a conversation with my families about emergencies that can come up, because I want them to know what that will look like, because that makes it less scary.
Yes.
Right? And so it's a really heavy conversation. So first and foremost, I have a handout, and it talks about the raw numbers, right? And so when they come in, we do all the beautiful, fun things, and I'll say, okay, we have to have a really heavy conversation. First, are you in a space where we can do that? Do you have a stretch where we can do that? It's gonna be heavy, and we're gonna get through it. We're gonna do it together, and then we're gonna let go of the fears, and we'll work through it. I like to do it at that point because the pregnancy is really, 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 really real, right? 12 weeks, if we have that conversation, it's real, but not really, really, really real. It hits home.
Yeah.
But then also we have, 4 to 6 weeks before we probably having a baby, so we have time to kind of work through those feelings. So we talk about it. So let's talk about those emergencies real quick. Here's the handout. Let's look at it together. And we look at it together. And first I say, what questions do you have about that? And they'll kind of ask us the questions. I'll say, okay, so this is what this could look like. And I just want you to know what it could look like if we have to move quickly. What I want you to know is your midwife, this midwife, always has probably 20 plans at every point, right? I'm always on. Even if I'm sitting there drinking coffee, looking like I'm just hanging out, I promise my job is risk assessment and management. I do that phenomenally well. My families know that really where I super shine is an emergency, unfortunately, fortunately, right? And so we just have the conversation. At the end, I'll say, whew, that was big. Wow, that was really big. So what I want you to do is I want you to think about it for a little bit at your next appointment, or even in a few days, if you have more questions, call me. Let's talk about it again. That's awesome, right? Mm-hmm. And then I want us to work through it. Sometimes I do some really bad therapy in my office. I've been in therapy long enough, but I pass things on, right? Mm-hmm. So I'll talk to them like, if fears come up, here's what I want you to do. Instead of being afraid, I want you to name it. What am I afraid of? And that shrinks the fear down. And so when we're dealing with emergencies, right, the fear gets really big, right? The anxiety kind of spirals. We're not going to do that. What are you afraid of? Can you name it? And oftentimes they're like, yes, right? What are you afraid of? Right? What can we do to mitigate that fear? Mm-hmm. How can we work on it? I teach them how to differentiate in the moment, right? When those fears come up, how can I help? How can I process that in that moment? And usually, if we do it that way, just head on, acknowledge this is heavy, this is big, but we have to talk about it, then usually they really accept that information and they don't tend to spiral. My people who spiral are the people who maybe say, I don't want to have that conversation. I don't want to know. Yeah. Unfortunately, they picked a midwife who's like, I know, but we're going to do it anyway. Here we go.
Our imaginations are powerful.
Yeah.
So when we don't know, often we assume the worst.
Yeah.
But when we know the facts and data,
yeah,
it's like, okay, knowledge is power. Now I can make an informed decision.
100%. And by the time we get to the birth, they're like, okay, what they really take is my midwife has got a plan, and she's going to be there with me every step of the way. Okay, I trust her, and that's a relationship, right? I trust them to make good decisions. They trust me in an emergency when I have to make the decisions to make really good ones for them.
It's fantastic. A lot of people don't know that midwives offer complete, safe prenatal care and are also medical providers. Not just woo-woo babies delivering babies in the woods.
Yeah.
So can you speak to what makes a midwife a safe choice for an expectant family?
Yeah, and so remember I told you how I started into this journey was really to prove to not just my hospital community that out of hospital can be done safely, but it's also sometimes to my birth community that out of hospital can be done safely, but it has to be done safely, right? And so how do you know that you're getting a safe midwife, or how do we do that in a safe way? Well, I think part of it starts with making sure we're offering a community standard of care, understanding why the hospitals offer the interventions that they offer, because then I can say, here's the intervention, here's what I think we actually need to do, or here's an alternative. So I think we start there, is really understanding what our community is asking for us to do. And then I think it is the other part of that, I think, is working low volume. I think it's 100% working low volume to keep everyone safe. If I don't have the time to spend with someone, then I don't have the time to provide them really good care. And I think in the Valley we do a really good job. I do think there is sometimes a misnomer that I'm a medical provider, right? And that I actually carry a medical license. And I'm not just someone who, I am someone who picked up and decided that they're going to be a midwife, but I actually went through the process. I carried 4-year Bachelor's of Science in midwifery to go through that process. I sat for national board exams to prove that I know the baseline information. I carry a state license. And so I think all of that helps promote that I'm a midwife. If you walk in my office, you'll see my bachelor's of science hanging up on the wall. That guy is so precious to me that I got that. I got that bachelor's of science with 6 kids, and I studied from midnight to 5 in the morning while I was writing a small midwifery practice, and I got it. My CPM, my certified professional credential up there, that's important to me. And I think that's really how we start changing it from being like woo-woo in the woods to I'm a medical provider. This is what I do really, really well.
Even doctors pick up and decide
Yeah.
that, hey, I'm going to be a doctor.
At some point, right?
My older brother is an anesthesiologist.
Oh, yeah.
And he didn't go to medical school until he was in his 40s.
Good for him.
Prior to that, he was a well site geologist working on the oil.
That's amazing. That's when you know it's what you're supposed to do, right? It calls you.
Totally.
Yeah. I think when medicine calls you, it just calls you, and you can't walk away from it. That's what I've experienced.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, he said he witnessed me being in the hospital for an extended period after I was hit by a drunk driver, and witnessed the life-saving care that I received. And yeah, it was a huge inspiration for him to completely change careers.
Yeah.
And
Wow, that's beautiful.
He loves what he does. So.
I bet. That's so good. That's so good.
Do you wish anything was different about the birth landscape in the Gallup Valley? And if you do, how are you working to change it?
Yeah. So I tend to be the person that's like, you're either part of the problem or part of the change, and I always want to be part of the change. So there are a few things that I'm working on right now to make things better, I hope. So one thing I've always noticed is kind of the split between the medical role and the midwifery role, right? We're kind of over here and they're over there. We kind of just look at each other. And so I really noticed that that started to kind of be an issue a little more in our family recently. And I have a few colleagues up at the hospital that were a little more personal, in a personal relationship. And I had someone take me aside and was like, we need some help here. Like, these two worlds have to talk more. This is what I'm seeing. Can you fix this? And the first thing I had to say was like, I know I can fix it from frigg, right? So let's work on that. And then I can work towards helping everyone get together and fix it. And so one thing I organized was I got with the head of labor delivery, Dr. Wolf, and I was like, hey, I think we have a problem. And she was like, hey, I think we have a problem. And when we started talking, we were able to identify where some of these problems were, and a lot of it was just communication or just not knowing some of the information. We had to have a long conversation about the credentialing of midwives and what that meant, and that everyone's individual practices, but we got through that, and then we were able to really identify specifically our transfers of care. So when we transfer from out of hospital birth or care into the hospital, that there were some things that were being missed or not known. And so I was able to talk with her, we were able to identify that. I was able to talk with the midwives, on a side note, kind of saying, like, hey, can we work on this? And everyone was in agreement. So Dr. Wolf and I organized a dinner where the midwives could sit down with Dr. Wolf and we could really start working through some of this, right? So, like, one thing that came up was, frigg has we have a protocol for everything, but we have a very distinct protocol for when we transfer in. Part of that was developed because when I worked at the birth center, I realized that there was some hiccups with our EMS teams, and I didn't understand what was going on. So my solution was, I'll just go become an EMT and I'll go through their schooling, and then I'll understand what they're doing.
Wow.
And so I did. I went to the schooling, and then I sat and I was able to be like, oh, okay, I see how you communicate. Okay, we can incorporate some of that communication style into how we communicate. I see why they're making decisions the way they're making decisions. Okay, we can work with that. We can kind of do things on our end to make that better. And really, once I did that, or when I worked at the birth center, that was many years ago, things got better. And so I had taken all that information into frigg and just had implemented it because it's just what we've done. Well, I didn't realize that if you had gone through the EMS training, you wouldn't have this information.
No.
So one thing that we identified very quickly was if we come in by an ambulance, that labor and delivery is not called. Right.
You go straight to the ER and
because EMS communication is simply through the ER.
Okay.
That's who they talk to. That's their people, right? So some of my colleagues didn't know that. So then if you picture this, they sent someone in an ambulance. You're in labor and delivery, just a nurse or a doctor, and you're just minding your own business, having your best day, drinking your coffee, and then a dumpster fire walks in, right? Rolls in very fast, right? And you're like, what? So that looks back from the hospital staff to the midwives, right? Because we had no clue what was going on. The midwives see a hospital staff that's caught, unaware. That looks bad to the midwives. Right. And it was not because both of these people were not wanting to work together. It was simply because the midwives didn't know that EMS wasn't called labor and delivery. Labor and delivery didn't know that the midwives didn't know.
Right.
So and you're laughing like, whoa, but you're working with 1, 2, 3 different businesses, 3 different providers, many different providers, but 3 different entities.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh. So then it was like, so Jazmin, how do you do that? And I said, oh, I call EMS, and then someone on my team, usually me, calls labor and delivery and gives a verbal. And they're like, oh. And then we talked about, I have a transfer sheet. So when you work with EMS, you have to say the information over 300. I gave 10 units of Pitocin, and then the EMS person who doesn't deal with Pitocin is like, how do you spell Pitocin? And because they don't deal with that.
Right.
That's not the major emergency we do.
Yeah.
So then I was like, we have a transfer sheet we have 2 transfer sheets. One that we can hand to the lead paramedic or lead EMT. We don't have to tell them that information. I can give them a verbal, but they've got it written down. They don't have to write another sticky note. It's right there. And then I have a second copy, because that copy's going to get lost, that when I roll in, however I'm getting there, I can hand to my attending as my staff is fixing up records, but I've already called the attending and given them a verbal. And so we did that meeting, I think it was last July. And when I did a follow-up with Dr. Wolf, she was like, things are better. And I talked to the midwives, and they're like, things are better. That worked. So that's where I'm really working. I was unofficially asked to be a liaison between the 2 worlds, and I officially said no thank you, but I will help bridge that communication.
Yeah.
Right? I'll help build that bridge, and we are working to make the communication and the worlds work better together. And these are 2 worlds that historically maybe don't like each other, right? Really disagree with each other. It doesn't matter if we disagree with each other, because midwives are going to keep midwifing, OBs are going to keep OBing. We need each other.
Yeah.
And to provide really great care to the families in this valley, we should be working together.
100%.
And we should identify those little hiccups that no one knew was there.
Right.
That caused so much problems.
Right.
But because we weren't having the conversation, no one knew.
Thank you.
Yeah. It was great. Oh, no, don't thank me. Thank these 2 worlds that were willing to come to the table,
Absolutely.
stare at each other, and just be like, okay, put that back. How can we do this better? And so I'm really thankful for these 2 worlds. The midwives in this community really want to do really a great job. The OBs really want to do a great job, and we are learning to talk together. So that's one of my pet projects. Yeah, me too.
Just as a little aside, I've always wondered, and maybe other people wonder too, why the name Frigg Birth? Where does that come from?
Okay. So that's funny. When I went back into private practice in 2020, my practice name was Motherly Birth and Wellness, okay? And I was 36 weeks pregnant with my 3-year-old, so that was, I don't know, almost 4 years ago, this is like before. And I got hit with a lawsuit with a great big company who had launched a business, and they had, I think, 8 different copyrights on the word motherly. I know this because I hired a lawyer thinking I'll fight this, and then the lawyer was like, you won't. So it was either I fight this and lose a lot of money and lose in the end because I didn't have their dollars, or I renamed. So I had, that was July, I had until December to completely rebrand. And if you know me well, you know I got really, really fiery about it all, and I really ranted and was super pissy about it all. Right. And so I was really going to name the practice the Beaver Box because I was just like, whatever. Right. Yeah. Epic. I don't care. In fact, that's what it was. Epic. I don't care. It's going to be the Beaver Box. That's what it is. They don't like it. Fine. Right. And so my husband, who works in marketing, was like, probably not the best. Right. Let's work on this. And so he was really beautiful and really listening to my ranting, tolerating the Beaver Box, and really helped pull me out of that anger. And we really started tossing around ideas. And so from a marketing standpoint, trending now are businesses with 1-word names, so you could be like frigg, right? And so we were tossing a bunch of things. I wanted it to be personal, but I didn't want it to be too personal because I keep a really big divide between professional and personal. And I really love Norse mythology, super into it. And so we were looking at like Scandinavian names. My husband's Scandinavian, so I'm Scottish, and those Gaelic words are hard.
Yeah.
No one's gonna get that what that says. So we were like, that one's out. And so we started going through Scandinavian words, Icelandic words, and we were just talking about the Norse gods, and we were like, huh. Well, there's got to be a goddess of mothering or birth or whatnot, and there is, and there's the All Mother, that's Frigg, that's Odin's wife, and she is the mother of the mothers, and she is compassionate, and she is tender, and she is the mother, and she's the goddess of midwifery, and she encompasses all that. And so we were like, Frigg, and I was like, well, it's one word, and I happened to say, and this is the part of Jazmin that lots of people don't often get to see it. I said, that's freaking amazing. And then as soon as that word came out, I was like, that's it.
There it is.
That's it, because it's personal. It's very intimate to me and my belief system, but it's funny. And I like that it's kind of F-bomby, if you know me.
Right.
That works a lot out of my mouth. And so that's what it was. It became Frigg. And to prevent copyright, I copyrighted Frigg, birth and wellness, and friggin', so it's mine. So we just talk about all the friggin' babies that are born, and it's funny, and it's just kind of personal.
I love that. I remember asking my mom when I was like 7 if there was like any like bad words I was allowed to say if I was frustrated or whatever. And the first word that I was allowed to say that wasn't like an issue was frigg.
Yeah.
So I love that.
In our house, it's fiddlesticks. You're not allowed to say fiddlesticks, but every other word is on the table. But yeah, so it's just funny.
Great. What do you feel, to piggyback on, what do you feel is your biggest accomplishment as a midwife? It's a big question.
That is a big question.
Or maybe a source, like a point of pride or something that really sticks out to you.
Yeah. That's hard. And I would say it's hard because I look at all the things I've done and sometimes they don't feel super intentional. Like I did this with this purpose. They just kind of fell into me, or I fell into it. I could easily say my CPM. I could easily say becoming a Montana state licensed midwife. When I got here, there was only one other out-of-state midwife who had ever been licensed in the state of Montana. And that was a challenge. And then I said, like, where do we change it to make it easier for out-of-state midwives to be licensed here? I could say that. I could say being in private practice. But if I was really honest, what I would say is the burnout for a midwife is 5 years. And what I'm really proud of is I'm 18 years in. I really come to terms with who I am as a midwife. I'm not the hippie midwife. I'm not the religious midwife. A little more medical. I like science and numbers, and I feel really, really confident in that. I think I have really great boundaries that allow me to provide really good care. But not only that, the boundaries allow me to be present with my own family. And they are the absolute loves of my life. When I'm on call, my birthing families are my priority. They're number one. But underneath all that, I couldn't do any of that without my family. And I think the fact that I haven't burned out in 18 years is really cool. So I think that I want to do this for 20 more years, maybe. Really cool. I think that my family still loves me and tolerates my shenanigans as a midwife. That's even cooler. So I think the fact that they're my number one priority, whenever I can do that for them and for myself, that's probably what I'm proudest of, to be truthful.
Love that.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you would like to say or you want our community to know, or anything at all that's still on your mind?
Yeah. I would say thank you for having me, first and foremost, right?
Thank you for being here.
Yeah. I would say to the families in our community, find your provider. Right? That's so, so, so important. Ask the questions. Don't ever feel bad about saying no to a provider. At some days I've had to save someone's life, and what makes that experience easier for everyone is that connection and that fit and that trust. It's so, so, so important. So if you're 12 weeks pregnant, 5 weeks pregnant, 30 weeks pregnant, take the time to find the right provider. And if it doesn't feel right, it's not right. And that's okay, right? That's okay. Find the right provider.
And that you can always switch.
You can always switch. always switch, you know, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. But find a provider that lines up with what you're hoping for, and just know sometimes it goes that way. Sometimes it doesn't go that way. We have to detour, but you should still have a beautiful birth, a respectful birth, and empowered birth.
Yes.
Right?
I remember I had a client a couple of years ago who had planned to give birth in the hospital.
Yeah.
And I asked her, if you could have it your way, if you could do anything, what do you want? She said, I just have this baby right here
Yeah.
in her house. And I was like, okay, let's do that.
Yeah.
Let me give you all these resources. I want you to call all these people. If you still want to give birth in the hospital, cool.
Yeah.
But if you find a better fit, even better.
Absolutely.
And she ended up having a home birth at the birth B&B provided by Midwife.
That's beautiful.
And it was awesome.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful. I've taken people in like as late as 36 weeks. I think I took someone in at 38 weeks. You know, it comes down to the fit and being low risk. It's never too late to find the right provider.
Right. Sometimes perhaps access might be an issue in really rural areas where there's not as many providers to choose from.
Yeah,
But here in Bozeman and the surrounding area, we have a lot.
we do. And we have a lot of great options. So I work with a lot of my clientele are from Bozeman or Belgrade, Three-Fourths Way or kind of Valley. But then a lot of them come in from out of town, so Clarkston, Whitehall, Lewistown, all over. And it's because I have a little birth cottage over in Belgrade. And any of my families, I've had Bozeman families birth at the birth cottage, right? Any of my families have access to that beautiful home that my dear friend Renee provides for us. And it's set up just like we call it a home birth away from home. And so that provides access to my families who maybe are a little too far from a hospital to make it super safe, increase risks there. So we talk about coming over to the cottage and birthing there. And it's been really, really beautiful. Tree of Life has their Airbnb birth suite. We have the Bozeman Birth Center. So we have lots of options that kind of match what people need, right? So I think that's really, really lovely. Not every place has those options.
And I've had 2 clients who ended up giving birth in Livingston and had great births
Yeah.
down there.
Yeah.
So a lot of people may think that a 45-minute drive is like, oh, it's so far. In the winter with the pass, it's probably a thing.
Totally.
But in the summer,
But March through November,
yeah.
you're pretty decent.
Yeah.
It's Livingston's a great option. They have really phenomenal providers over there. They have OB's family practice and they have a nurse midwife body wall who's phenomenal. And they have one-to-one staffing and they're all lactation specialists and it's great. The food's phenomenal. Yeah, it's a really wonderful option. We have some great options here.
And I'm so happy to know more about you and your practice and your approach. And thank you so much for being here. I'm excited to get this video up on the website and share it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been great.
Thank you.
Yeah.